it had arrived in the UK. It's very disheartening when something is taking over a certain part of the world and has not yet touched the West. So in Africa, with the Ebola pandemic, it felt like the world had ended. I mean, people were bleeding out. They couldn't touch their loved ones. And yet we found a way to go back in 2 or 3 times. I mean, West Africa was completely locked up. At one point, we flew in on Air Morocco, and it wasn't clear whether there would be a flight for us to take out. But it was felt that that was an acceptable risk. And I feel, especially as someone who's not from the West, who's from Sudan, I feel slightly, well, not slightly, I feel incredibly uncomfortable about how comfortable our editors are when it comes to sending us to these places far away, that perhaps they don't have an understanding or a personal metric for the extent of the risk. And it's happening to all those people out there, and how different the security measures have become when it's something that's happening here at home. And my personal experience has been quite interesting, that at the beginning, I was off unwell for the first few months of the pandemic, so I wasn't part of the coverage plan right at the beginning. But what was really interesting to me is that the teams that were putting their hands up from the inside CNN to get out and cover this were our foreign teams. So they were the same people who were used to going out and facing down these risks, and they became utilized. I think we've lost Frank. They became utilized internally. So it has been, I'm not going to lie, it has kind of reinforced a few of my pre-existing concerns about the way we approach covering out there versus covering back here, that suddenly now we're all working from home, and that is the right thing to do. But given the risks that we are asked to take when the threat is not here at home, I do think that's something that we should think about, at least for a moment, that how much more concerned our bosses are when it's here and they can see it around them than they are when it's affecting other people, and there isn't that invisible sense of invincibility.
If I can ask, did this create divisions in the London bureau, or in terms of the international operation, in terms of threshold for risk or approaching this? Because it's a really interesting how people in the West or people elsewhere might respond differently to these assignments. I think
for us, it has always been, as in most newsroom, it's, you put your hand up. If you're not comfortable, then nobody's going to send you. But it was just something that and now people, this was right at the beginning, but now people are going out and they are much more comfortable and much more willing to go out and cover it and feel quite strongly about covering it. But it was just really interesting to me that it was yet again, the Muppets, the foreign lot, who were happy to go out into these situations before there'd been any kind of tried and tested security measures. To be honest, there have also been a lot of people who have stepped up and been incredibly brave, but it did just reinforce to me this sense of, there wasn't this sense of kind of, we're all in it together, this global community. It is always, when something happens here on our doorsteps, then the world really must be on fire, as opposed to when it happens far away in China, because China had SARS, China had Ian obviously can speak much better to this than I can. But this is not the first time that people have been faced with a deadly disease. It's just the first time that these safe, I put it in quotation marks, European and American capital cities have been faced with this. And it was just quite interesting to see the way that people mentally took quite some time to turn that corner about what they were and weren't prepared to risk.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that real.
Yeah, please jump in, because I think it's a great point. Please.
Yeah, no, if I could just jump in, I was really struck when the pandemic was hitting China in late January and February. The coverage, and it's worth going back and looking at the coverage in February about China's methods. And it was a real sort of othering coverage that, oh my God, the Chinese are doing this. They're locking down. They've got an app in the phone that tracks where you're going. Only China could do this. It's a totalitarian country. And I was like, wait a minute. Now the NHS is offering stuff in our phone. So we had lockdowns more severe in Italy than was in China. Everything that's sort of, not that China does have a stronger authoritarian system, and they did lock down in a more draconian way, and they have zero tolerance toward the virus in a way that wouldn't be acceptable. But many of the measures were not that strange. And even when it was clear statistically that the numbers were cresting in China and going down, people weren't really writing about that. They were writing about how this was just like the barbaric Spanish flu in 1918 when they quarantined people in stadiums or whatever it was. And yet all these things sort of came to pass in the West, and there wasn't that much reflection, I thought, on the coverage, on how, it would be something quite interesting for a grad student or somebody to go back and just look at that and write about it.
I wanted to say, Emily Fang is our correspondent in Beijing, and at one point she did so many stories on what was happening in China, and then at the end she was very sad, and she said, nobody listened to me. I tried to convince people in the United States that this was very serious, and she felt like no one listened to her.
Yeah, it was funny because people kept saying, when is the WHO going to declare this?
Is there something else we get this across to people? Is there something journalists do to help cut through and make people in the West?
I think until it hits home, it's hard for people to grasp it. I think there just is, people are so set in their ways. I think it's just very hard. Even when the WHO declared it a pandemic quite early on, in early February, people in most Western countries, or at least the governments, were not really doing anything about it. And it was only when the numbers started to skyrocket here that the governments finally took action.
I also think, sorry, just jumping off the back of that, Ian, that I mean, as someone who grew up under a dictatorship, what I'm constantly surprised by is this worldview that our systems in the West work, that no matter what history has shown us about the ways in which the systems have failed, that somehow, I mean, I remember just after President Trump was elected, having a very serious conversation with an American person who said to me, no, we have systems that will protect us. And I said, the systems are only as strong as the will of the people upholding them. And I was really looked at like, well, of course you think that. You're some African who grew up in a dictatorship. But it is, in a way, I think if there is one thing that we take away from the tumult of the last few years, it has really driven home that we are all the same. Those of us who've had to report from overseas have tried to drive that home to people, that these aren't funny looking people in funny hats, and therefore they will act a certain way, and we are somehow immune from that because we are in the civilized West. What's come home to people is that if you don't hold your government to account, they will fail you. The systems are not robust unless you test them and check. And that also, and of course I'm biased, so I'll say this, that journalism is bloody important. That journalism isn't just important in places where they're on the verge of a coup every 5 minutes. Journalism is important everywhere because we are the stress test of the system. And I don't know how I dare say that in front of you, Ian, and Lindsey and Jeremy, because I'm in awe of being around all of you, and Frank. That's my one little rant about stress testing the system.
I'm wondering, in the impact, what's your sense?
We're sometimes struggling to hear you, Frank. Can you say it again?
I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm having this challenge. I was asking, right now, is COVID playing? And so how being there in the midst of the pandemic, what kind of impact is it having on the campaign? To switch on over to my pick this up if someone can.
I would, I'm afraid.
I think that question was to you, Ian. How much play is COVID getting in China still?
Well, it's still, in China, it's still getting a lot of play, but mainly to show, naturally, the inherent supremacy of the Communist Party's leadership under the direction of Chairman Xi Jinping, because it shows that China's path was correct and that the naysayers were trying to demonize China. So that's it's actually, but it has actually just, it has actually worked to legitimize the party. This early on, people were, they thought, people around the world are the same. Nobody likes the lockdown, and the lockdown was unpopular in China. People thought it was a little bit over the top, isn't it, all this stuff? There was a lot of social media chatter about how this was not necessary. But then when they saw what happened in Western countries where there wasn't really a lockdown or a half-hearted lockdown, and it didn't take a lot of twerking by the state media in China to show that this was a debacle in many Western European and in the United States, in these countries. So it played sort of into the hands of the party to show, at least to make it easy to show, or to seem to show that this was necessary, that the party's rule, its style of government is necessary. So
that's not really the first time, is it, Ian? Because I remember when I first got to China in 2006, I can remember Chinese people were completely baffled by what had happened in New Orleans with the hurricane. They just couldn't believe the chaos and that people had died, and why hadn't, because I mean, Ian, you know much better than me, but the Yangtze floods every year, and I don't know how many people they move out by bus every year, maybe 1 million, maybe 500,000, but it's a normal thing, isn't it, that this happens, and they're organized and they do it. And I think that they find it quite extraordinary that in the name of freedom and all this stuff in this country where I am now, they really can't organize a piss up in the proverbial brewery. They can't, sort out a natural disaster like that, and you're on your own.
How are you?
Yeah, I think it's had a big effect on the soft power of the United States. When you think about around the world, so many CDCs, Centers for Disease Controls, were named after the CDC in Atlanta. It's sort of the CDC, and everyone's sort of patterned on it. And Americans are going, send this CDC liaison person in the Beijing office would be sort of out there in the field teaching the Chinese, so to say, how to run a CDC. And now the CDC has been turned into this politicized tool. It isn't able to do this, that, or the other thing. They're belittled. It's sort of unbelievable, really, how you see this institutional rot in the United States being played out in agonizing detail. And it's just fodder for authoritarian governments around the world.
But I think that the other thing that I think is really interesting is I was in Brazil, right, which obviously is one of the worst, and where you have Bolsonaro, and this whole issue of these strongman leaders, and they are men, and how badly they have coped with this. And because Trump would be one of them, maybe Modi, and well, actually Erdogan's done quite well, but most of them, they're so good at campaigning and they're so poor at governing, and this is really about governing. And I think that as journalists, one of the things we're guilty of is we love a strong man, because a strong man is such good color. They're great to cover. And we hate systems because they're so boring, aren't they? We hate bureaucracy. And we don't cover it. We just sort of, but actually what this pandemic has shown us is how important the boring people are. The bureaucrats, the people who make the CDC work or not work, people out there, the health administrators, all of these people are really important. And we as journalists would much rather be chasing after some colorful person than dealing with issues of governance.
Sorry to miss you all. I'm sure you were in very good health. I hope you can hear me. I think my daughter was doing an online class in the United States, and that may have been the challenge, which I suppose I should have checked earlier to see if she had class. I'm curious, as we go into the fall and the autumn, and we think about where we might be reporting from, are you thinking of new strategies? Or what are you thinking? I'll start with Jeremy.
I lost the second half of your question. Were you saying as we get towards the end of the year, what might we be doing?
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, will you be traveling as much? And are there any new strategies that you have based on your experience so far?
Well, to be honest, what I find is that the barrier to getting on air the hurdle is so much higher now, because so much of our output is dominated by COVID and by the domestic political fallout, and by the domestic economic fallout, and by the towards the end of the year we're going to have Brexit rearing its ugly head again. So actually, if you look at BBC, I'm not talking about BBC World News now, but BBC domestic coverage, who pay my salary. There have been two since the start of the pandemic. I'd say there have been two stories only that really cut through, which was Black Lives Matter and the Lebanon explosion. And I'm trying to think if there are any other really big stories, but I know that, I mean, I made my first visit into, because I was in London when the explosion happened, I made my first visit into Broadcasting House to put together a package on the night it occurred. And the producers on our news programs were so pleased not to be doing anything involving a pandemic. For them, it was it was something different, a long last. So I'm trying to work out how I'm going to try and earn my money, because in the Middle East, if you get to some countries, you have to quarantine on arrival. So there's a good story in Israel at the moment, but I think pretty sure you have to quarantine on arrival if you go there. You then have to quarantine on arrival when you come back. So if it's 2 weeks both ends, that's a month. Before we know where we are, it's going to be next year. So I'm not expecting to travel vastly. I mean, it's a shame because there are things happening in the world. I actually did a radio program for BBC Radio for about, in about May, and they had a series called Meanwhile In, which was the idea of the series was, let's do some programs about stories that we might be talking about if it wasn't for COVID-19 and lockdown. So I did something about the current situation in Syria, which is highly newsworthy, but wasn't getting on at all. So I think someone else did something about Tokyo without the Olympics, that sort of thing. So, so that was a device to get around this sort of the looming pandemic. And I do think that, I mean, like all professional journalists, I watch a ridiculous amount on an average day, or read a ridiculous amount of news stuff, just out of habit, really. But even I have been finding it, sometimes I think, oh, screw it, I'm not going to watch it tonight, because it's always the same. It's always the same story. And so I do think, for the sake of our poor audiences who don't have the same overwhelming compulsion to check the news every couple of minutes, that actually it's quite important to try and vary the diet, because otherwise people might just get a bit browned off with it all.
Nima, what about the situation in terms of, obviously you're CNN International, so you're for a global audience, but you're also trying to get, what's that like with the campaign going on?
Well, so increasingly, actually, that I'm going to be a bit naughty and say, unfortunately, that silo between CNN International and CNN Domestic is lifting, because there was quite a gratifying acknowledgement that actually what we brought to CNN, the kind of the mothership, was our international coverage and was all these bureaus. And there's whenever you meet colleagues from other US networks, they always say they hate it when international news breaks, because it means that CNN has an edge because we can mobilize quicker. It's just been one of those years, right? Where it's like, first we were trying to work around Trump. Then once we kind of figured out how to work the system to work around Trump, which was if you think that Trump's damage at home is important, then you also need to focus on the damage that this administration is doing in your name abroad. So we did a really big investigation last January on US weapons sales to the Gulf allies and all the ways in which they were worsening an already appalling situation in Yemen. And then we got one last documentary off the ground, and then the impeachment happened. I think there is a very interesting conversation being had right now in parallel with the Black Lives Matter conversation about the soul of journalism, about fundamentally what do we do? And there is kind of almost a cognitive dissonance in a lot of newsrooms where they think that they are doing not only the newsworthy thing, but the moral and important thing to highlight these movements. But what's been really interesting is that those of us who are of minority backgrounds keep trying to explain to people that you need to amplify non-white voices everywhere. And part of what Black Lives Matter is doing is it's saying you can't just privilege a certain story or a certain prism for that story. You have to amplify these stories wherever you find them. And that's been quite difficult, but I've made myself very annoying, which Lindsey will attest I'm quite good at.
She's good at that.
Yes, exceptionally good at that. It's my superpower. And the moral impetus is a phrase that I probably use far too much. We managed to get an investigation about Yemen done about 2 weeks ago, about the impact of it was just so morally egregious that it was one of those stories that kind of sold itself. You have the US that is selling weapons to the parties in the conflict in Yemen and then cutting its aid to the humanitarian program. And it is beyond a tragedy in a country that's 80% reliant on aid. For Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to cut their aid when they are parties to the coalition and were key parties to the conflict. And it was just, again, really interesting for me because even colleagues see the kind of the US administration and they see the rallies and they see the strongman politics, they still found it almost startling because this is not who we see ourselves as in the US was something that I heard a lot. And it's like, well, why do you think it is so important to keep doing what we do? Because if he's letting homes burn on the west coast of California, then what do you think this administration is doing in your name where you can't see it? But to be honest with you, it was a bloody nightmare. It was days and days and days of calling Yemen, having to send WhatsApp voice notes because their network is even worse than it's ever been, of working with people in the States. So essentially getting like 3 hours sleep, but also because it was an investigation and we were having to verify these internal UN briefing documents about the extent of the cuts. It also, unfortunately, because we were working through other teams to verify their impact on the ground, just pushed the bar to an almost unsurmountable level because we were giving it the platform of CNN without having to be on the ground. And in a way, I'm really worried that that the investigation, it was great that it had impact and it was great that it got more money out of the Saudis and it was great that USAID says they're going to give more money. But I worry about the message that it sends to our bosses that we can do this because I'm going to tell you, honestly, it almost killed me. I don't know how many more of these we can do. And I also think it's incredibly unfair to our audience because if we're not there verifying, Lindsey taught me this many years ago. She said to me, you are an avatar for the audience. And if we are not there on the ground to be an avatar for the audience, and I'm still saying that this is an investigation that you can trust, it makes it incredibly difficult to continue doing those kind of investigations that have that kind of impact.
Nimla, do you think with your editors that they look at the fact that you were able to pull this off as an opportunity for cost saving at some point and doing more of these kinds of things? And have you tried to disabuse them of that notion?
Yes, I'm currently in the process of attempting to disabuse them of that because I'd quite like to get to Yemen at some point. But yeah, unfortunately, the same way that this COVID environment has created a lot of great opportunities, like, I broadcast from literally this little corner. And as somebody who attempted 3.5 years ago to have a functioning relationship with my little boy, after I came back from maternity leave and still do all the things that a foreign correspondent is expecting to do. That is an excellent part of what this whole experience has taught us, that actually parents can work from home, you can be more present, you only really need to go when you need to go. But the flip side of that is I have now proved that for $15,000, they can have a similar impact to what they would have paid $70,000, $80,000. And that worries me because we, touch wood, have actually successfully gotten away without a lot of cost-cutting measures. But how much more are we going to be able to survive this? And it's kind of to Lindsey and Jeremy's point about the environment in which Sir Harold Evans came up. It was when there was a fundamental belief that journalism could not just be impactful, it could also be profitable. And now there seems to be this belief that, yes, you can be impactful, but maybe be a little less impactful and kind of spread that impact across a couple of stories, because we're only going to let you do maybe 3-4 a year.
What I'd say about traveling and going to places is that I would always push our lot very hard to do it, because, you know, you can get so much as a reporter out of being in a place, just, you know, in a morning, just the smell of it, talking to people and so on. Then you can get from a week of trying to do stuff through a screen.
Definitely.
And that's been, of course, one of the frustrations, as you've so articulately pointed out, of this whole process at the moment, and this whole business of, you know, working from home, which is on, you know, on one level, it's quite nice. I've got, you know, plenty of space and a nice garden, and the weather was good. My 19-year-old daughter was back from university, and it was very pleasant, actually, on some levels. But to operate as a journalist, you do need to, you know, it's a basic thing that I'm sure Harold Evans said to his guys on the Northern Echo in 1961 or whatever it was, that you've got to narrow the distance between yourself and the story. And that's really important to try to get at what's actually going on.
Ian, I was wondering, there are so many great Chinese journalists who worked in China who have now been forced out because of relations between the United States. And can you talk a little bit about how people are trying to cover China now? Maybe you had a chance to do this and I missed it. But how people are trying to cover China now when they can't actually be there, not for COVID reasons, but political reasons.
Yeah, I think the politics is actually joined up with COVID, because the COVID has also been an excuse for China not to allow a lot of journalists back in who had left China in February or March to sort of get away from the epidemic. So the upshot is that many journalists are trapped outside of China and haven't been able to get back in, ostensibly for COVID reasons as well. But the effect is that we're almost going back to something like in the 1960s and 70s, where there were only a handful of journalists in China and many people on the periphery of China looking in and trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, there's still many more journalists today are in China, but I think there's a feeling, and I think this existed before, that you could figure out what was going on in China without having to be there. That many magazines had closed their bureaus in China. Many newspapers had, many of the sort of opinion makers at various blogs and podcasts. It's amazing really how few people are based in China compared to, say, 10 years ago. That China's become more of a sort of hardship post. It's not as fun. There's a real high around the Olympics, I think, in 2008, and everyone was going to China. And afterwards, it was sort of became airpocalypse, and then Xi Jinping took over, and it was just sort of this long downer story. And a lot of people left, and they haven't been replaced. And so this has just added to that. You know, you do have some questionable things that happen. For example, the Times, the New York Times, has been covering China out of necessity, mainly from Hong Kong and Taiwan and Seoul. But they don't dateline the stories, you know, and which is sort of used to be a cardinal rule that you had to dateline a story, and they sometimes don't, and they'll say, it used to always be said in a telephone interview if you're doing it by telephone, and otherwise the assumption was that you'd seen that person face to face. They used to be quite sticklers for that, and now you'll see things like it's just an interview, but you know that person is not in China, and they could not possibly have interviewed the person, and there are I think the Times doesn't even have any fixtures left in China because they were all fired as well by the government, forced them all to resign. So I think they're doing this by telephone and not exactly saying that. I think that's it's a worrying development, but this has been what's been going on. I think with Google Translate and all this sort of stuff, people feel they understand what's going on in the world without going there. And you can sort of be more impactful by having a smart Twitter account than actually by reporting stuff. And so I think it's just sped up trends that were, this is the cliche of the pandemic, right? That it sped up trends that were already going on. And this is one example.
We have a question from Haley Davidson. She says, why do you think that news producers are so reticent to cover international issues? Is there evidence that the public aren't interested? And how can those of us who are convinced our news channels and agencies that we still care and want to hear about conflict and crises happening beyond our borders and beyond just COVID? I'd like to jump in.
Can I take that?
I mean,
oh, sorry, Lindsey, you go ahead.
I think we've to some extent answered. I don't think our editors are reluctant. Mine aren't reluctant, but it's very difficult because of all the logistical things that we've talked about. And also, I don't think it is unreasonable. I mean, I work for a program which is 1 hour per night in the UK. It's a British, Channel 4 News British program. There isn't a world aspect to it. We've always covered a lot of international news, and we still do to some extent. But when you have got a crisis like COVID and like Brexit, I don't think it's unreasonable that the agenda should be dominated by that in a program that's broadcasting to the UK. That's completely reasonable. Now, then you also try and put in other things. But the reason I'm here in the US is because I looked at the end of the year and I thought, COVID, Brexit, US elections. So what am I going to do? I can sit in my... I can sit in my study at home and pitch 2 minutes agency wrap on Burkina Faso once a week. Or I can go to my editor and say, I really want to do the US elections this time because we always, we have a correspondent here, but we always have extra teams. And, I jumped in first and pushed hardest, and that's why I'm here. Because I want to be out there and do the reporting. And I think that the viewers want that too. And we will have other reporting, and we will have other issues and other places reported, and we have a lot of stringers in different places, not necessarily our own staff correspondents, but we have a good network around the world, and we've reported COVID very much from around the world. We've done a lot from Latin America, less maybe from other places, but yeah, we do want to do it. It's just a lot harder than it was last year.
Does anybody have any other strategies going forward for being able to cover this a little bit better? I'm here in the United Kingdom. I mostly covered. It's been quite easy in the sense that I haven't had to get on planes. I've mostly been, sometimes at the beginning during lockdown, I was on my bike, then traveling by train. But curious, after these 5 or 6 months of dealing with this, if there are new approaches that you would be taking.
My new approach is not necessarily regarding how we operate when we're on the ground, but just to kind of reflect back to the question that Haley asked about how do you as an audience express your interest in these stories. I feel a bit unfair keeping saying my editors, because our actual head of news gathering, Debs Rayner, is amazing and is a huge fan of international news. So she's very much a kind of a co-conspirator in this. But what we have found is that our biggest weapon, our strongest weapon is the internet. So if these are stories that you care about, click on them, tweet them out, click on them. And we have found that contrary to what a lot of programmers or show editors believe, because we have multiple show editors through our 24 hours, about what the audience wants to see, the audience votes with their clicks. And that's hugely heartening, that actually when we have managed to kind of steer the ship towards this foreign story and kind of go, no, you must cover it, that actually there is a huge audience response. So I think I will probably find myself, and again, to that point of it sped up trends that were already coming. I think that kind of digital first functionality of being a journalist has been a long time coming, although there will always be the prestige of making the news at 7 or making the news at 10, or for us getting onto the Situation Room and the domestic primes. Digital is changing the way we pitch, because often we will pitch first digitally, and then when we see that pickup, those statistics, those metrics are very difficult to argue with, that the audience went and sort that out and they want to see that. And so I think increasingly that's what more and more foreign journalists are going to be doing. They're going to be pushing out their journalism on digital first.
I mean, I'll say one other thing, which is now I am absolutely talking against myself, and so and against Jeremy and them and all of us, which is, of course, it is an opportunity for people reporting in their own countries as opposed to the big I am coming in. And we you know, and the BBC has a tremendous network of journalists who are reporting on their own countries, and we have a far lesser one, but we do have one. You know, maybe that will happen more and more, and that is not all bad by any means.
How I got on air.
It's me out of a job in the end.
But that's how I got on air. I was in Sudan. I was in Darfur. It was locked. Nobody foreign could get in, and Lindsey and Jon Snow met me. And you're right, it's absolutely no bad thing. But it also, unfortunately, the prestige and the focus comes when you or Jeremy get on a plane. And when an audience, when a viewer looks up and sees, oh, well, this was worth the BBC or Channel 4 News sending Lindsey Hilsum or Jeremy Bowen, they do sit up a little straighter and watch. So I think
maybe they need to change their attitude.
Well, I do.
They said they didn't need to go to Darfur when you were reporting from there.
Ian, you're working on another book on China. Do you have most of your reporting done, or do you still have stuff you have to do and you're now outside the country? And if that's the case, what are your strategies?
Oh, I'm just going to fictionalize it. You know, nobody knows. All these strange Chinese names with Zs and Qs and Xs. They can't be real anyways, right?
That's the way to do it. Yeah.
This has been a very illuminating panel. Thank you all for your time.
wait, let me just. No, I was planning to leave China next year anyway. Famous last word. I was going to leave next year, and one more year, another drink before I go. But I actually was going to leave next year, and I came here to the UK for family reasons, and then I got expelled. I found out I was expelled, and so I couldn't go back and get all my stuff, and so on. But I had about 90% of the book reported, and I think, like with a lot of times when you're working on something, that you over reported anyway, and I have enough to do it for sure. But I just will miss going to China. I hope I can go back at least as a tourist and stuff like that. I'm not sure how all this will play out. Probably have to let the dust settle. But I've been in China as a correspondent for 20 years, so it was probably time to leave anyway. Yeah. And
okay, but you know, some of your work and some of your book writing on China is among the best that's been done in the last 2 decades. And there's been tremendous amount of well, I thought so. But a tremendous amount of good work done by people who have your language skills and gotten to know the people very intimately. Our correspondents in China now say it is very different than the China that you and I covered in the 90s, let alone China in 2016, 2017. People are really scared in a different way. And I'm cautious about reaching out to some of the people that I know well. And I'm just wondering, can people write the kind of intimate books that you and people like Peter Hessler and Evan Osnos of the New Yorker have written over the last 20 years? Do you think it can still be done?
I think it'll be different. I think it may require, I think it could be harder if you're on a journalist visa and you have that J visa. It's like the Scarlet Letter or something. You know, they know what you're doing and things like that. And you may have more people who are writing books like that who are, say, teaching or doing something else. But I think it is the end of an era in a way, because I think that there was this period at the end of the 70s up until a few years ago when China allowed in correspondence because they thought this was sort of part of the game. Maybe we don't like what they're writing, but it's sort of what you have to do to be part of the world. It's part of joining WTO or whatever. And now they're finding, you know what, actually, we don't really need to have foreign correspondents here. We don't like them. They're troublesome. They're asking all these questions. And if we kick them out, it doesn't really affect us. And the only thing is maybe you have some token foreign correspondents in because you can then show Chinese people that China is a normal country, by having foreign correspondents, have a few people at the annual press conference at the National People's Congress to stand up and ask a question or whatever. But you don't really need them. There's nothing really the outside world can do. I mean, you can huff and puff like the administration is doing in Washington, but at the end of the day, what are you going to do? You still have the same trade ties, etc.
Yeah, but one thing I have to say is, in amongst all that, it is extraordinary, the reporting that has been done on Xinjiang and now on Tibet. And that is, you know, a lot of that is academics, Adrian Zenz and other people, and obviously the satellite imagery and all the rest of it. And I remember when I was in Xinjiang, I mean, it was pretty bloody hard to find out anything because everybody was so terrified of talking to you anyway. And certainly we did find things, and, you know, we drove past the labor camp, we saw the people in the orange, you know, doing the digging. So there were things that we got from being there we couldn't have got elsewhere. And of course, for myself, I got an understanding, a feeling, a sense of place and so on. But some of the reporting on Xinjiang, I think, has been extraordinary by people who aren't there, but who very brave Chinese people, you know, reach out and send stuff. And a lot of Chinese people, you know, sending messages somehow or other, smuggling information out to their families who are then able to talk to Western journalists. And I mean, it's so much harder, but so essential that that happens.
Yeah, no, I think we live in a much more transparent world, and that's why the analogy, say, to the Cultural Revolution isn't accurate, because then people really had no idea what was going on in China. Yeah. And when I went there as a correspondent in the early 90s, we still subscribed to all the provincial newspapers because that's how you found out what was going on in some southern province. You know, a few days later, the newspaper would arrive in your office, and you go through it and read, oh, there was an earthquake or something. Otherwise, you didn't know. And nowadays, obviously, there's so much more information out there. The things you mentioned in Xinjiang were partly because they had done bidding to build public sort of tender offers to build these camps, and so you could actually prove how many meters of barbed wire they had been buying for these things. So it's incredible, the transparency that the internet brings. But I still think, I guess we all would agree, as sort of preaching to the choir here, that the boots on the ground to test drive some of those hypotheses, like we think they're building this thing, the satellite images show that, but even just driving by it, even if you can't get out of your car, I mean, that's just invaluable to say, I saw that there is barbed wire on the top, there are people in yellow jumpsuits or whatever, orange jumpsuits inside. That's just invaluable. And I don't mean that will never happen, but it's just a lot harder now.
Pranvera, there's a question from a David Wallace, and I was wondering if it's possible to highlight and see if you'd like to ask it to the panel. And if not, I will read it myself. So I want to do this start with Jeremy. What do you all think about the future of proper journalism in the face of populist leaders like Trump and Johnson who don't engage? When was the last time a senior minister appeared on Channel 4? This coupled with the fact that so many people are getting their news from social media. I don't know when the last time a senior minister was on Channel 4, but Jeremy and then Lindsey, if you'd like to take this.
Well, the government actually initially, the Conservative government, after it was elected with this very large majority, decided it was going to boycott the morning radio program here, the Today program, because it didn't like it. And that is for those people who, if there's anyone listening who isn't familiar with British broadcasting, the Today program is a sort of national institution, and traditionally it's quite agenda setting and the politicians go on it. But when the pandemic started, they suddenly felt the need that they had to communicate, and now some of them are rarely off it. I mean, Matt Hancock's been on it more than some of the presenters, I think, the health. So they actually do need the media in that sense. To be honest, you know, I've never been a great one for interviewing heads of government, and if they don't want to talk to us, fine. I mean, I don't really care about it. I actually think that governments need the media in a sense more than we need governments. I've always felt that when, you know, on those occasions when maybe a minister might take you aside or an official and say, you know, what's really going on here? He's spinning a line. You know, very often I always think, why is that man or that woman telling me this? Because actually, I would rather test it myself by seeing what they're doing, talking to people affected, seeing what's happening on the streets or around and about the place. So, you know, if you don't get an insider briefing, well, so what, really? You know, a lot of that's spin anyway. I personally think that at this time of very fragmented media and fake news and not knowing what to trust, people always, you know, say very rude things about the mainstream media, but actually I don't think the mainstream media has ever been more necessary than it is right now, because you know, people may have suspicions about what it is we get up to, but most of us do want to get it right, actually, and aren't trying to push a line. And something I wanted to say apropos the last question about contacting, you know, in China, you were saying, and you got the regional newspapers. A colleague of mine, Justin Webb, in the 80s, he filled in for the BBC's very long-serving Delhi correspondent, Mark Tully. And he was very surprised to find out that to communicate in those days with some of the more far-flung stringers, he'd write a letter to find out if there was anything going on in his neck of the woods. So maybe that's what we're going to have to get back to. But I think, you know, to take that question seriously, these, you know, populist leaders, yeah, they're not open and they are manipulative, but it's up to us to try and get through that and get around it.
We have another question, and Owen Johnson asks, given all the challenges you face now, why would anyone want to be a and
yeah, good question. Be an investment banker.
And where will they come from? So does anyone, I haven't, I'd rather hear from you guys.
Look, I still think it's the best job in the world.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I still think it's the best job in the world, and this is a very, very difficult year, but there's nowhere I want to be other than, well, I don't really want to be in Washington now, but I will be in Arizona and I will be in Florida and I will be in all these places, and that's where I want to be because that's where the story is and that's the most exciting thing. But I do think, and it does come back to something you were talking about before, that increasingly people will, I mean, I think that, you know, all journalism is local in the end, and I think it is really important when we're talking about democratic accountability. I do think that ministers should appear on Channel 4 News. They choose not to. They choose, they won't do Channel 4 News, Piers Morgan or Newsnight at the moment because they think we're too challenging and they don't like the questions we ask. Well, you know what, we're not going to ask less challenging questions. That's not how it works. But of course, I think that they should be. They should appear in our program, but the same is true in all, you know, in all countries. And you know, I love my job as a foreign correspondent, but I do think that what's really important is people coming up and reporting in their own countries. I work with a small organisation in Marie Colvin's end, the Marie Colvin Journalist Network, where we support young female journalists in the Middle East, Arab journalists. And, you know, they're the ones, they're the future, they're the people who are reporting in their own countries from all over the Middle East. And in the end, I think that they're the ones who are going to be more important in the years to come than people like me.
Actually, a question right along those lines for Nima. Alimia Ali asks, do you think Sudanese journalists would get the chance to become international reporters like yourself by starting from Sudan now? Or has the situation changed from when you started in the early 2000s?
I think, to Lindsey's point, that in a lot of ways it is easier, and I you know, I don't mean to embarrass Lindsey, but I owe her a great debt of gratitude, because when I was looking to come up as a broadcast journalist, people like me were what we sometimes refer to as fixers, which is not a great word, but essentially the people that make everything happen. You do everything, and then someone who doesn't look like you gets in front of the camera. And I think newspapers have done a much better job than we have as broadcast journalists, because it's helped them save a lot of money, where they are using, and with Syria and even with Lebanon, it meant that they circumvented a lot of the costs and the security concerns by using journalists reporting on their own context. So I think in a lot of ways it is far, far easier, because even when I started, Lindsey was one of the few rare women who had achieved that kind of level of prestige. So now there are many more, let's be frank, white women in these places reporting on these contexts, and every generation pushes it a little further. But I feel really, really deeply about the fact that newsrooms have to understand that Black Lives Matter, amplifying the voices of people of color, it starts inside. And part of that is amplifying the voices of people of color reporting on their own stories. And we have to ask ourselves not only who is reporting on these stories, but whose stories are we privileging? And if you need to see either white people, to be blunt, either white people being reported on or a white reporter reporting on it for you to care about this story, then it's up to us to kind of move the audience's comfort zone. So yes, please, more Sudanese journalists, more, more foreign correspondents in general who are not white and Western. That's my plea.